Hi, Ian and Sophie here. We're the site pastors of our Cardiff North site. Thanks for tuning in to today's thought for the day. Throughout this week, we've been sharing daily reflections from John's Gospel as we journey together towards Easter Sunday.
So today we are looking at the beginning of chapter 19. And if you caught yesterday's video, you'll recall that we're at this point in the story where Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate. He's been accused by the Jews of breaking the law. They've branded him a criminal who needs to be put to death. And we get this dialogue as Pilate goes back and forth to Jesus and the Jews. And he's trying to work out who Jesus is and whether it's right that he should be sentenced to death. And at the end of chapter 18, Pilate has offered the Jews an opportunity to release one prisoner. And rather than choosing Jesus, they choose to release Barabbas.
So as we move into chapter 19, in the opening verses we're told how Pilate sends Jesus to be beaten and whipped. Whilst this was happening, the soldiers mocked Jesus by making him a crown of thorns which they put on his head. And they also put a purple robe on him and hurled abuse at him, shouting, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And whilst they did this, they struck him repeatedly across the face. Pilate brings Jesus out and presents him before the crowds again, and they shout out, "Crucify, crucify." They're desperate for Jesus to be sentenced. But Pilate wasn't sure. He doesn't feel comfortable. He's caught in two minds. He's being pulled this way and that by the opinion of the Jewish crowds, and also by the words of Jesus. Who should he listen to? He can't find any crime or charge against Jesus, but the Jews are insisting that he's broken the Jewish law by claiming to be the divine Son of God. When Pilate confronts Jesus again, he wants to know once and for all who he is. "Where do you come from?" he asks Jesus in verse 9. What he's really asking is, who are you? Are you really the Son of God as you've been claiming to be?
Now, throughout John's Gospel, John goes to great lengths to let the audience know the identity of Jesus, whilst those in the narrative are struggling to see the truth about who he is. This is the question that Pilate himself is deliberating over here. Who is Jesus? And I think that's a question for all of us. We can all put ourselves in Pilate's shoes and ask ourselves, who is Jesus? In Matthew 16, Jesus looks his disciples straight in the eye and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And he could just as well be looking at each of us and saying the same question. Who do you say that I am? And the answer that we give is pivotal in our lives. So who do you say that Jesus is? Is he just a profound teacher, a controversial rebel, a historical wannabe? Or is he the Son of God, the Messiah, the King, the Lord of your life? That is something worth pondering this Easter. Who is Jesus to you?
The answer that Jesus gives to Pilate in verse 11 points towards the heavenly authority. And Pilate understands. He begins to believe that Jesus really is who he says he is. It says in verse 12 that from this point on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." In other words, if you let this man go, your life will be at risk. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat, ready to give the verdict. The voice of the crowd had continued to influence Pilate. And this reminds me of something that James said in his talk on Sunday. He said, "We have to let the truth of Scripture be stronger than the voice of the world." Pilate heard the truth, didn't he? He heard it directly from the mouth of Jesus. But he was swayed by the voice of the world as the crowd shouted, take him away, crucify him." As you consider who Jesus is this Easter and search for an answer to the question, who do you say that I am? Which voice is loudest in your life? We have to let the truth of Scripture be stronger than the voice of the world.
So today, why don't you put yourself in Pilate's shoes and consider who Jesus really is? Today's passage ends in verse 16, which says, "Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. The verdict is given, and Jesus is sentenced to death." Tomorrow is Good Friday, and you can tune in at 10:30am as Alice is going to lead us in a reflection on the beginning of the most pivotal event in history, the crucifixion of Jesus.